We have developed questions to guide the panel discussion. Elaine will assist us to make sure that we call on you to provide comments throughout this session. If you would like to comment, please raise your hand. Elaine will acknowledge you and write your name down on our list here. We have 4 questions that we would like to discuss during the next 60 minutes, so that means 15 minutes per question. So our first question here is, how do we best synthesize findings from means and interrupted time series analyses in evaluating whether an ADF has resulted in a meaningful reduction in abuse? Anyone would like to start the discussion?
I have a question related to this. A meaningful reduction in abuse.
This is Dr. Schnoll speaking for the record.
Sorry. Yes. I have a question. Are we talking about a meaningful reduction in abuse in the patient population or a meaningful reduction in abuse in a non-patient population? Very different, as we've talked about this morning, and I'm not sure we can look at both of them simultaneously and come up with conclusions.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are interested in both, and I agree that we may not be able to evaluate both of those questions or answer both of those questions in a single population or in a single study. And so, you know, what we typically see in this area, as you know, is a suite of studies to try to get at different aspects of these questions. So if you have thoughts on how best to do this in one or the other of those populations, or both, we'd be interested in hearing those.
I would think you have to, as we discussed this morning, I think you have to separate them because they are so different. And, you know, when we look at the patient population, the people to whom the drug was prescribed, I mean, I often refer back to the Adams study where they actually followed about 11,000 people who were given hydrocodone product, and about 4% developed some surrogates that could be related to abuse. So it's a pretty low level, and this was before a lot of the stuff that we call the secular changes were implemented. So we're talking about very small change potentially, whereas in the abusing population you've got a lot more, but it's harder to find those people and follow them over time, and we would need the more epidemiologic approaches. With the patient population, I think you almost have to do a prospective study with random assignment to various drugs, and then look at the epidemiologic data to see if it's concordant with what you're seeing in the prospective study.
I have a clarification question too. Synthesized findings sounds like meta-analysis. I mean, it doesn't really seem to connect to the presented confounding issues, that question.
Yeah, maybe synthesize is not the best word, but how to interpret findings from these very different types of analyses that we typically will see, you know, means analyses, so the pre-post type analysis, and then also an interrupted time series analysis, and the results can be quite different. And I think in the last talk you had mentioned that for you know, when you have a dynamic system, that the interrupted time series may be more useful than a means analysis, but you know, the interpretation of those is somewhat less intuitive in terms of thinking about what a reduction in abuse means. So I think we'd just like to get thoughts from the panel on how to interpret the results of these different types of analyses that we see in this space. Does that help at all? In terms of making a causal inference
I think
about the
you alluded
impact
very
of
well to
abuse.
the issues already. Everything that you presented summarizes the issues in each of them. I don't see a disadvantage in an interrupted time series analysis over a mean, because the metric is the same. You just have more of it in one versus the other, and that is always a matter of sample size and how often and how many distinct measurement points you have available, and that's where the issue might lie. Depending on what kind of data source is used, there may not be the opportunity to chunk this in small enough increments to really put a regression line through it. But beyond that, the issues remain the same. I feel like I would reiterate what you just basically presented if I answered it. I think you did a wonderful job in describing the problem.
So,
all right, we can move on.
so you got a solution there, Albert?
So we have Dan Budnitz, Erin Krebs, and Jody Green.
Yeah, it's Dan Budnitz. I'll simply summarize. We've used in our program means analyses when we had to, ITS when we could. I mean, it's basically the same idea that we usually don't have enough data points to do an ITS, but when we do, we prefer it. That's simple.
Erin Krebs, and I don't know what else I can add to all that, but everything we've talked about today suggests that really what you are going to have to do is sort of qualitatively synthesize findings from multiple studies to try to understand the big picture, and there's not going to be any one method that's going to be effective for that. It'll be hard to make any real strong conclusions from any one study, I suspect, given what we know about all the assumptions that would have to be made in any design.
Jody Green. I guess maybe this adds to the list of problems, but the other issue we have is that really, let's be honest, there's only one product left that actually has a pre-period of having a product on the market without an abuse-deterrent formulation. Now we have all the new products that will be coming out that there is no pre-period. So while these methods might be appropriate for one product, they're not going to be for the rest of the products that are coming out. So I'm not sure if that's later in the discussion or if that's tomorrow, of alternative methods of evaluating.
If you have, I think that's like question number 3, but if you have thoughts about different design approaches for products that don't have a non-abuse deterrent precursor, that's something we'd be very interested in discussing.
And question 3.
You can discuss it now if it's in the forefront of your mind.
Well, I think it goes back to having a better definition too of meaningful reduction in abuse, and meaningful reduction in abuse can mean a whole lot of different things. And I think there's the meaningful reduction in abuse of prescription products. I also have seen the introduction of adding heroin as comparators or other illicit products, which complicates, I think, things a little bit more. And I'd like to understand more about how that fits into kind of the scope of monitoring these products in the legitimate pain population. To Dr. Snoll's point, that's very different than looking at the recreational users. But really, I think it's better definitions of meaningful reduction, and then also in those comparators, because you can certainly have that baseline prior to introduction of a new product. If you can find that appropriate comparator and does it have an impact on that, and then we'll have to talk about confounders and how do you adjust for the other interventions, the PDMPs and all the policy, and the changing market outside of just that new product, both the pharmaceutical and the illicit products. So probably, I'm not sure that's a solution, but my recommendation anyway would be to get at a better definition of meaningful reduction, because I'm not sure that we get a good sense as scientists what that means and how to do it. And also, it just says in abuse, and so does that mean abuse is the primary and we're not looking at misuse, addiction, overdose, and death? And so what really is that meaningful reduction, its definition?
I think using abuse is kind of generally to represent the particular outcome that you're you're looking at, so maybe abuse by a specific route or other related outcomes.
Okay, we have Leland McClure and then Alma Winterstein.
When I think of hypothesis tools and I see analysis of means, the first thing that jumps to my mind is that you've got a parametric or bell-shaped population curve that's there. And that may not necessarily be the case on there. You may have something that's skewed in terms of the population and the occurrences or the frequency that's there. Have you given thoughts to non-parametric analysis of medians tools also? Analysis of means could skew the data if it's not bell-shaped distribution on there. And you might not get the most accurate answer that's on there. Non-parametric analysis tools for the hypothesis testing would probably give a little bit more of a robust analysis on there. Just a comment.
That's a very good point. I think the reason you mentioned the parametric assumption does not only apply to the mean analysis, but also the interrupted time series as well. So do you think there is any remedy for interrupted time series?
I think it would depend upon the data. You really need to do normality analysis on there and then apply the appropriate tool on there, whether it's analysis of medians or means. You know, you can transform data so that it fits a means model, but then you have to be able to back transform that into what I would view as data that a layperson can understand into, you know, practical units of measure that are there.
Thank you.
Dr. Winterstein?
Since Dr. Staffer challenged me now, but I had a I had a similar idea as Dr. Green. I think that, you know, there may be enough experience now for comparative safety approaches instead of time series. So essentially, you know, thinking about, I mean, the analogies of comparative effectiveness approaches of a new drug that comes on the market, you know, you could do you know, time varying propensity score adjustment chunks of moving forward to see how abuse starts to change with a new drug that comes on the market relative to everything else that is already on the market. And that might be a less biased approach. Obviously the bias is different. Now we have confounding. Before we have time as a confounder. Now we have patient characteristics as a confounder. And maybe they could be seen as complementary approaches. But I mean, last time I started to think about this was my solution to this, that there is enough data now if you use more recent data sets to start to look.
I think it's time for us to move to the next question. How can we overcome some of the challenges associated with using comparators to approximate the counterfactual in ecologic time series study?
I really like this question, and I'm glad you guys asked it. And I see Dr. Myers.
This is Dr. Dasgupta speaking.
Sorry, I'm bad at that. And I see Dr. Myers going to talk about applying the counterfactual framework to an individual level tomorrow. But you know, when we think of, I mean, the choice of comparators has really been what's the API, what's the ERI or formulation, what's the sales volume. Those three kind of dimensions are basically what has driven all the decisions. When you put it into a counterfactual framework, right? If we start at the individual level, like why is this patient getting an ADF, and what is their propensity for getting the outcome, right? So then you know what the confounders are there. And it's going to be kind of baseline characteristics of that individual, right? So but when you extrapolate that to the community level, as you've articulated, it gets really confusing, right? So what we're basically trying to say is like, why would a community have higher rates of ADF dispensing than than other 3-digit zip codes that wouldn't, right? If you have ADF exposure as the exposure, and any of your abuse outcomes is the outcome, right? So within that counterfactual framework, then on an individual level, you would want to compare. You would want to compare the individual patient's baseline risk, right? So in that sense, like maybe we shouldn't be starting with APIs, but starting with individual patient risk. I think that's obvious on the individual level. So this kind of gets back to my earlier comment about, and this is what drove that line of inquiry, was that if you have certain communities where ADFs are much more prevalent as a market share, there's something fundamental happening in those communities, which could also be driving the abuse outcomes. And I think one example I can think of off the top of my head is in Maine and a few other states. There's financial parity, and there's a financial parity law where ADFs have to be priced the same as non-ADFs. And so there are places where we can start to examine what geographic level characteristics might be influencing ADF prescribing and outcomes, which would then give us a better idea of what the correct comparator should be. I know that's a lot, but I'm happy to draw it out or talk about it in more detail if you like.
Yeah, I guess I am having a little bit of trouble understanding how that would drive our choices of comparators in a time series type, the aggregate type analyses that we typically are seeing.
Yeah, I think it's tough. If maybe the comparator bucket isn't all ER opioids or isn't all of one API, but maybe it's some subset of those patients. So maybe there's some weighting. If we know what the individual characteristics are of patients getting each different opioid, and we know what the community level exposure is to those as well, then there could be a way to weight that exposure based on an individual level observation at a community level, where you're not just using one API or one class as a comparator, but using a similar risk pool. I can elaborate more on that offline, but.
Are there any other comments on comparators and choosing comparators and how useful they are to approximate the counterfactual in these kinds of time series analyses? Okay. All right.
So the third question is, what are some potential alternative analytic approaches to evaluate the effect of an ADF using the currently available data source, particularly for products without a recent non-ADF precursor?
It's Sichnal. I think I suggested it before, and looking at a patient population in a prospective way, you can do almost a double-blind kind of study, offering them an ADF or non-ADF, similar API, following them over time, seeing what happens, and then looking at that in relation to more broad epidemiologic data to see what's going on. Are there similar changes? If not, why? Begin to look at it. Again, you're looking at two separate populations, which is of concern. But in fact, if there are general changes that are occurring because of the formulation, I think you will see it.
Okay, and I think tomorrow we'll have more discussion on that type of a study. But of course, we aren't only interested in patients that are prescribed the medications. So, we are interested in reducing adverse outcomes and reducing abuse related to diverted drugs that are available in the community that aren't necessarily prescribed to a patient. And so that assembling that type of a cohort isn't gonna get you that answer.
Well, what I'm saying is you need two parallel things going on. One is looking at people to whom the drug was prescribed, and the other is then looking at the broader epidemiologic studies that would encompass the group to which the drug was not prescribed, and see what's going on. But I'll, get back to what I said very early in the meeting. I'm not sure that we should be looking at all these very general things about abuse, because these drugs were designed to do very specific things. And when you try to look at everything that may be going on, it's problematic. I think, what we've seen to some extent now, which we really have to address in another way, is the fact that what we've been doing in terms of ADFs, PDMPs, some of the education, some of the CDC guidelines, those who are abusers are now using illicit heroin, illicit fentanyl. So we have, in effect, driven those people who want to abuse drugs in a different direction. And that's a big problem. But it might generally show the ADFs are working. But we have unfortunate consequences to the fact they're working. And we can't think of the ADF as solving that. We have to look at other approaches.
Captain Budnitz,
Yeah, Dan Budditz. I'm trying to think of approaches when you don't have a non-ADF precursor. And I mean, this is kind of simplistic, but and challenging because the market penetration of the ADF is so low, but as it increases, you can look at the rates of change of your outcome as the rate of ADF penetration increases. Now that's more of a hypothetical because we have such low rates of use right now, but that might be an approach if you don't have a precursor.
This is Vincent Leray. I like, actually, I want to endorse Dr. Winterstein's idea of taking a comparative safety approach, which I think actually might make sense here, and focusing on only those who are prescribed the drug, because I think this is going to be challenging in settings where you don't have people who are prescribed the drug. But assuming that you had appropriate data sources, assuming that you had validated outcomes of interest, perhaps drug overdose or even death, I think maybe perhaps comparing ADFs to non-ADFs potentially in the same class, following new initiators over time for incident, even death, and comparing relative incidences of those over time may be of value. And it was discussed about the development of propensity scores. Certainly people who get ADFs may be different from people who don't get ADFs in ways that may relate to outcomes of interest. So developing propensity scores at the time of initial prescription, and potentially even over each month of follow-up, for example, maybe even developing some kind of marginal structural model approach, may be alternative approaches. Again, assuming that you had the appropriate data sources with validated outcomes. That might be, I recognize that doesn't address changes over time pre versus post, but it would give you some ability to compare the relative incidences in important endpoints across the different ADF versus non-ADF drugs.
Following up, I think, with that comment also, when we look at comparisons of the pre and the post, you probably need to look at polypharmacy trends also because of the co-presence of fentanyl and heroin that may be admixed with those drugs in combination on that. So you need to look at those confounding factors also and look at those, the pre and the post also as well.
and this may be entirely hypothetical, this is Erin Krebs, but another pre-post situation you could look for, if it existed, would be a situation in which a payer or a health system or someone else substituted some sort of new product in for a previous non-ADF product, or that kind of change where there could be a comparison between different payers or different geographic areas or something like that. Now, I don't know if that would actually have to exist in order to analyze such a thing, but.
So you're referring to something like a change in the formulary, or?
Exactly, yeah.
It's an interesting thought. Pardon me. I mean, I like all of these ideas. We are very limited by the fact that typically in electronic healthcare data and claims data, we can't get at those very outcomes that we're most interested in looking at, which is as Dr. Schnoll said, the root of abuse. Are you changing or reducing snorting and injecting, and those things are not going to be captured in healthcare data, and so we turn to these other kind of non-conventional or different sources, and they bring with them a host of different challenges.
This is Judy Steff. I wanted to just ask a question. On this patient-based approach model, I'm trying to understand, so if we start with patients prescribed these products, right? But remembering that the product is not going to stop someone from becoming addicted. It's not going to stop someone from perhaps moving into an abuse mode. But the idea is we're supposed to be trying to stop them from moving into snorting or injecting non-oral routes, say. I don't know how long that takes for a patient to get to that point. I'm not sure any of us really understands the natural history of that. But we hear lots of anecdotal information of folks at our meetings that come to the microphone and tell us tragic stories about how they started with a simple prescription that was prescribed to them, and years later they ended up, injecting heroin. So this implies we'd be studying these patients for a very, very, very long time. But I'm not quite sure, are we actually going to be getting at the question, again, the target of these products, which is this non-oral abuse, this kind of toward well-advanced, that's what I'm imagining, is that it's well-advanced abuse, people who are continuing to take products orally and taking more than they should because they have developed a tolerance or become dependent. These products we know are not going to touch that. So I'm trying to understand that patient-based model. I understand that it's a key piece, but is it enough? Are we missing the other piece of this? I mean, I know it's the harder piece, but are we really going to get, if we have those kind of studies, are we really going to be happy with those answers? Are we really going to get robust answers about how well these formulations work? I'm just throwing that out there to provoke you.
So this is Dan Budnett. So I think the key question that one has to ask then is, what is the incidence of this type of insufflation and injection abuse, and what is the effectiveness of the abuse deterrent formulation? And we have to start with those questions and then power our study, and we might find that it's an impossible study and impossibly long study to make it worthwhile. I think those kind of assumptions need to be the first step: the magnitude effect and the incidence of this specific type of abuse of interest.
Yeah, that's a challenge. So every time we have a patient level approach of exposure, we're relying on claims data or EHR data. Yet we cannot measure that type of abuse in those data unless we had a good number of resources and constructed a study where we actually follow up or pull charts. So I think it's fair to assume that a substance use diagnosis, that somebody who would abuse intranasally or IV would also have a substance use diagnosis at that point. So if the endpoint in a claims data set, assuming sensitivity, but assuming that the endpoint in a claims data set would be substance use diagnosis, and that would then be supplemented with an additional chart review that tries to ascertain the information of how the drug is being used, that might get to this. Another way would be to try to link the data that we have on abuse, like from treatment centers, to see whether that can be pulled together. But this is the general challenge, right? That the exposure information that we have in claims data is not linked to abuse information that we have in surveys.
Okay, Elizabeth Crane.
Based on experience with the Drug Abuse Warning Network, the route of administration was not always included, but it was in there more than you might think. Not enough to produce estimates, and it was primarily there to help us identify inhalants. But we wondered, why is it always, it was usually things like injection and smoking of drugs. And we realized, well, probably it's because if somebody's taking an oral medication orally, they don't bother to note it in the record. But if they're using it in an unusual way, like injecting it or snorting it or something, it would be more likely to be documented. Now, we never compared the route of administration, by different types of drugs. It would have been interesting to look at the opioids. But I think one of the things this is the kind of information that we're hoping to get out of the clinical notes that we hope will be submitted to the National Hospital Care Survey, which I'm guessing we'll talk about maybe tomorrow. Again, it depends on how much people write in the notes, and if we can get them, but that was where we were getting the rich information from Dawn, was what was being documented in the chart.
I feel like the question that we were asked here was more focused on what you had sort of clarified as the outcomes of interest, death, addiction, overdose. But the questions that Judy, you're referring to, sort of when did an ADF, when did the patient decide that they wanted to switch to an abuse, crushing it, insufflating. I think those are the only kinds of, I don't think you're going to get that in a retrospective. I think that's the kind of thing, those are the kinds of specific questions that you're really only going to be able to ask patients prospectively. And I think that would be, if you're really interested in understanding more of the behaviors and the biology of what's going on, I think, prospective studies where, like I said, I'd mentioned before about using CASI and questioning patients over time about behaviors for the different ADFs, particularly for persons who are prescribed, would be valuable. But I think from the standpoint of if you're interested simply in what are the incidences or rates of overdoses or death, harder outcomes, then potentially using electronic health data may be able to get at some of those questions. But I think it really comes down to what are the key questions, and then obviously designing the studies differently based on what the agency thinks are the key questions. But I think they're different questions structurally.
This is Mark Levinson. We're going to have a session at the end of the day to follow up some ideas, and tomorrow we're going to have a session both on cohort studies and linking data sets. So a lot of these ideas we'll have opportunities to discuss tomorrow. But I'd like to maybe focus this question, if we can, on this numerator-only data. Are there analytical approaches for the data sets that were introduced by Cindy in the first talk of the day, the treatment center data or the poison center data? I find the propensity scores with a time-varying population very interesting. Do people feel those could be applied to this numerator-only data? What might be some of the complications, or how might we overcome them?
This is Scott Novak. A lot of those advanced causal inference statistical procedures like Heckman selection models and propensity score modeling are built on really rigorous assumptions, and sometimes you run into low cell sizes with the off diagonal, and sometimes I think that there's not enough emphasis placed on sort of testing for balance, and that's really the key thing. And there's been a lot of really interesting development on really the misuse of propensity rather than sort of the appropriate use of them. So I think a lot of people think like, oh yeah, it's a tool and it's great, and they use it for all situations, but it's really limited, and unfortunately in terms of some of the questions that we have with ADF and the low uptake, you may not get the appropriate power to use those techniques, especially when you're dealing with a lot of different effect modifiers that might be of interest to you.
last question. What can we reasonably infer from aggregate changes in abuse rates about an ADF's effect on the risk of abuse for an individual exposed to the product? And the same question for the abuse via a specific route.
This is Judy Staffa. So this is about where we are. This is what we're seeing, are these aggregate ecologic studies. And so I guess we need to understand if you guys have thoughts on that, on what do we do with that? Is that, I mean, that's what we've got right now. So we'll talk tomorrow about what we can do better in the future, but this has got to be about what can we do with what we have now, and what are your thoughts on that?
Could you tell us if it's our turn to talk? Because I'm having a little trouble reading.
Okay.
This is going to sound a little facetious, but I would go to Dan, and I would have him talk to the folks he works with and tell them if they want any of these products. Because, you know, we heard a lot with OxyContin after the reformulation. It's just street value. You know, people weren't that interested in it. That may have resurged. They may have found other ways to use it, but is it appealing to people? I mean, I know that these are very small numbers and they're not out there that much, but that would be one way of getting us a very superficial sense of, you know, if it's having the effect on a certain population.
Yeah, I'm still reserving some thoughts for the appropriate time of the meeting, but I would say for now, we you know, one thing to assume, we would like to assume that moving forward, that the ADFs work. So what we're looking for is we're looking for the exception, right? We're looking for the one that sneaks through, that is a weak ADF, or there's some manipulable quality to it. So I'll just throw that out as sort of my own provocation here, and that is, I'd like to assume going forward that for this, well, I'm sorry, I guess it's really question number 3, that for the basket of meds that are coming out now that don't have any pre-data, that they work, that we actually don't see. So we're looking for blips on the radar screen. So it's sort of a different model. And we can talk about what picking up blips would look like moving forward.
All right, Dr. Winterstein.
I guess I have a question again. You know, when we approve a drug for hypertension, we typically don't know whether that drug will work for a given patient, right? So I mean, typically approval decisions and regulatory decision making is not on the patient level; it's made on the population level. Is there something else that
Right.
I don't
I
get
think
from that
if-
question?
If we carry that hypertension example out, you know, I don't think that we would make regulatory decisions based on a study that shows that you know, the rate of hypertension in the population before this drug was approved was whatever 25%, and then after the drug was approved, the rate of hypertension just in the general population was 17%, and that's kind of what we have here. That's kind of what we're doing with these studies. So you know, looking at these aggregate rates in the population before and after, you know, a drug was approved, but you don't necessarily, you know, you don't have that the exposure and outcome level and the data in the same individual, linked to the same individual. So I guess you know, the purpose of the question here was just sort of to ask, you know, are we answering the question that we're trying to answer using these kinds of, you know, ecologic time series aggregate study designs. So we'd just be interested in getting the panel's thoughts on that. But
Right, or this is Judy Steffa, or do we need to go to a model where we actually show that a patient who gets to a point where they were going to snort or inject this drug does not do that because of this formulation, or someone who is snorting and injecting stops because of this formulation.
Well, or
Do you
Judy.
see the difference?
Or Judy, that Dan's got it right. That these data tell us enough that we can conclude that these products begin with an assumption of efficacy. So, I mean, that sort of Bayesian or whatever, tell me what the right words are, approach, you could conclude that. You're drawing on a broad set of background. It is not the hypertension model. I did hypertension drugs. Hypertension drugs don't even always work in population. So we can't use that as a comparator here. But does the trend data give us enough assurance that you can begin with a preconception that there is plausibility that the products are going to work based on the tiers 1 through 3 plus the available information across classes of compounds. I don't know what the answer, but that does turn all of this on its head. Then you're worried about the blips, Dan. I don't know that was a good word. You're worried about the products that have safety considerations that make them unattractive. You're worried about things that suggest they would not work because they looked fundamentally different than the other products.
Dr. Lurie?
I'm just curious then, I mean, why doesn't the agency then push more for randomized studies of ADF versus non-ADFs and look over some period of time for all of the 5 outcomes of interest?
Okay, well, I'm not, Mark Levinson, I'm not prepared to speak completely for the agency, but I think it's probably a question of power that, for a patient population, the event rates are rather low, that it would require very large studies to answer these questions. There may be other complications as well if anyone wants to add to that.
So just speaking about the illicit market, users are out there, Jay Unick. For the illicit market, users are out there figuring this stuff out all the time. And they are working very hard to defeat these mechanisms given available supply. And so when it shows up in large quantities in communities of injection drug users, which are, you can find them at needle exchange or other locations like this. So they know what's working and what's not working. We just have to find them. And they show up in various places, whether it's hospitals for overdoses or needle exchange or even treatment sites, but you have to ask the question specifically about what they're using and how they defeat these mechanisms. And then that gives you the blips. That's what our recent experience certainly tells us.
Sid Schnall, I mean, it almost sounds like you're trying to see if the needle moves on abuse and addiction in general. And that's a hard thing to do. And, certainly what I've seen now in my 50 years of doing this, that you put something that blocks one drug either at the source or something else, and it shifts. The whole problem shifts to another drug that's more available. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in the same class. It can be another class. And we see these patterns. If you look over the past 50 years, there's stimulant, then there's depressant, then there's stimulant, depressant. These patterns have been persistent for a long period of time. In the overall abuse and addiction area, it's very hard to move that needle. And I agree what was said earlier, that one of the places where you might be able to get some information about the abuser population is syringe exchange programs, other programs that are dealing with harm reduction, where you can ask some questions and get some data. Whether those data are biased in some way based on what's going on in a specific area, but at least you're getting some data on that. And in the patient population, certainly you're aware of the development of the prescription opioid misuse abuse questionnaire, the POMAC, and we're looking at validation of that instrument, but that hopefully, if it's validated, could be an instrument that's used with the patient population, and maybe some variation could be used with the non-patient population. But I'm just concerned about the idea of moving the needle on drug abuse in general. That's a heavy needle to move, and you need a lot of power, and I don't think you're going to move it. Dan?
Dan Budd at CDC. I guess I was gonna, second that thought that to try to change all outcomes of overdose and death across both patients and non-patients might be a lot to ask for these products. And then to focus on the issue of the effectiveness in preventing insufflation and injection, it might be too rare occurrence over too long a term to really have a study that demonstrates effectiveness there. So then we got to this point of looking for blips, essentially safety signals, but that turns this whole paradigm on its head. Now we're not looking for effectiveness, now we're doing post-marketing safety surveillance, and a lot of folks here have a lot of experience in post-marketing safety surveillance, and that's with outbreak detection, it's with MedWatch reports, it's with a whole different set of tools, and it's a totally different question. And so I think this presumption of effectiveness turns everything upside down. But I don't know if we have, I guess we have these phase 1, 2, 3 type studies, but I don't know the phase 4 studies, but I'm not integrally involved in this field, so